Joining us now for some insight into how things are looking in Canada, we have Garvie in Toronto. Drew is a candidate for the Communist Party of Canada running against incumbent Member of Parliament Chrystia Freeland, who's of course Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Great to see you, Drew.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me.
Now let's start with the blackface, brownface episode, which provoked a great deal of conversation and commentary about how Trudeau's costume is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to this government's imperialist crimes.
Yes, that's true. The revelations that Trudeau made several racist portrayals of racialized people by dressing up, for a number of years, stretching over a 10-year period, made quite an impression on the voting public in Canada this election. But what is not really, unfortunately, part of the conversation across Canada is Canada's foreign policy and the need for a real foreign policy of peace and disarmament, which is one of the main reasons we, the Communist Party, decided to run in the riding of Chrystia Freeland. And those crimes are many, like you said. For example, this was on a band of troops, Canadian troops are now in Mali, in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, in Iraq. So this is an expansion and a deepening of Canada's imperialist role around the world. And of course, Canada's leading role that they're playing in the regime change efforts in Venezuela, selling arms to the Middle East, and also trying to work with Trump to isolate China and also attacking Russia.
As you said, Drew, Chrystia Freeland and Trudeau have led the charge against Venezuela's democratically elected government. They're pouring a great deal of effort into this so-called Lima group and putting money into what amounts to coup efforts. How do Canadians feel about the incessant involvement of their government in the sovereign affairs of another country and the sanctions which are being imposed?
Yes, well, it is ironic. Chrystia Freeland has gone on and on about how, like other countries, that Russia or China or even Venezuela might threaten this election in Canada. But it's actually Chrystia Freeland and the Trudeau government that have played a leading role in trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela. In 2017, it was Canada that rounded up the right-wing governments in the hemisphere in order to bring them into the Lima group, which is outside of a group of nations outside of any internationally recognized group of nations. And it included some of the worst human rights defenders in the region, including Colombia, which murders social movement leaders on a regular basis, Honduras, which is also had a stolen election right in 2017, and there's massive social movements trying to recall the president, Juan Orlando Hernandez. So Chrystia Freeland rounded them all up and then gave full support to Juan Guaido after trying to doing her best to sabotage the election in Venezuela, including not allowing Venezuelan Canadians to vote in Canada. And she's been a leading mouthpiece, doing, sitting right next to Bolsonaro, the fascist president of Brazil, and calling with a straight face for the overthrow of President Maduro. So it's blatant hypocrisy, and the only way to explain it is her close proximity to the White House and to Washington, and also because of Canadian business interests in the region, especially mining, which we can see unfolding right now with Canadian company Crystal X on the verge of potentially getting assets that were stripped from the Venezuelan government in the United States. Billions of dollars will end up in Canadian corporate coffers as a result of Canada's support for this coup attempt.
And back to the election, Drew, we'll always hear these arguments that a vote for a small party like the Communist Party of Canada, it constitutes vote splitting, taking support away from candidates in the NDP. And Jagmeet Singh, what does your party say about the kind of social democracy the New Democrats or the Green Party are offering?
Well, we see the main enemy as the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, which if the Conservative Party manages to form a majority government again, would be even worse for this country. And it would probably continue Chrystia Freeland's warmongering around the world. But in terms of the NDP and the Greens, we see a need to exist and run and get votes. This is because, take for example, foreign policy. The NDP and the Greens do not have a consistent foreign policy of peace and disarmament. In fact, the NDP has voted for several NATO wars. They have said terrible things in support of regime change in Venezuela and waffled. The leader Jagmeet Singh waffled during the coup attempt that Canada was supporting. So we need a clear voice to call for peace and disarmament. And in the short term, getting rid of Chrystia Freeland and the Liberals would be a good thing. But in the long term, we need much more fundamental change. We need to get at the root of Canada's foreign policy of imperialism, and that includes getting rid of corporate power. Corporate power is the root of imperialism. So the only party that's really advancing a new system along those lines is the Communist Party of Canada.
And we can't talk about Canada without discussing Indigenous sovereignty. What does the Communist Party of Canada have to offer in terms of that?
Trudeau was elected in 2015, promising a new nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous people. But at the end of the day, it's been more of the same. And most Canadians, and especially Indigenous peoples, recognize this. The most telling, two telling examples of this were the buying of the Kinder Morgan pipeline in order to force it through, despite protests of many First Nations along the route, and also the invasion of the Unistoten camp and the forcing through a pipeline on Wet'suwet'en territory earlier this year. So those were stark examples, but fundamentally there has not been a change in terms of the genocidal policy of the Canadian state. There remains a suicide crisis on reserves. There remain boil water advisories. So what the Communist Party calls for is the immediate introduction of the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples into legislation in Canada. And the most important part of this is the right to veto development that affects First Nations land. And this is a step towards real self-determination and sovereignty of Indigenous nations in this country. And it's something that the Liberals and the Conservatives say is not necessary, which is ridiculous. Fundamentally, we see Canada as a multinational state, and we need a new equal and voluntary partnership of First Nations, of English Canada, of Quebec, of Acadians, and we need a new constitution based on equality of these nations if we're going to live together on this land. And right now, it's just more of the same old oppression from Ottawa.
Short on time, Drew, but one last question. The NDP famously took out the word socialist from its party constitution under former leader Thomas Mulcair just a few years back. Does the Communist Party of Canada intend to remove communist from its name anytime soon?
No, we're proud of being communists, despite the history of the Cold War that has left a bad taste in some people's mouths. But there's more and more Canadians that are open to these ideas because they see the system isn't working for them. In fact, a recent poll showed a majority of Canadians were in favor of socialism, and more people are turning towards our party. So no, we're going to be consistent and hold on to our principles.
Thank you so much, Drew. We've been speaking to Drew Garvie. He's a candidate running for Member of Parliament in the same riding as Chrystia Freeland in Toronto, Canada.